Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar about Myhub and the security of Myhub. My name is Tara Conrad. I'm the product manager for Myhub, and I work in the ideation center at Clearinghouse. I've been here about 3 years, and I'm so glad that you're all here with us for this conversation. For today, I'm going to turn it over to John Ramsey, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at Clearinghouse.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Ramsey, Chief Information Security Officer here at the Clearinghouse. I've been here for about 4 years, and Myhub is near and dear to my heart. It's not often a CISO gets to help build and secure a product from the ground up, and this is one of those opportunities. So we had involved security from step one throughout the whole creation of the product line to the deployment. So our goal here today is to help explain some of the logic behind some of the security behind Myhub and what we're doing to keep the learners' data safe. And to start off with a little bit about the Clearinghouse. We're a partner with many of you. At the end of the day, we interact with millions of PII records. It's important that you know that the security of learner data, student data, is important not only to you, but to us. Our entire culture focuses on the security of the learner data and making sure that this is a better environment for them. We get asked often about Myhub and the identity proofing and the authentication and single sign-on. So again, today I'm hoping to provide some clarity with today's presentation on how we interact and do that. I'm going to try to take a complex technical process, and I'm going to try to use some pictures and thoughts and logic behind it to help explain what's really driving the security needs on what we've done. The presentation will be about 30 minutes. It's allotted for an hour. We got plenty of time if you wish for questions and answers. And then, the last couple of thoughts. We know it's stressful to making sure that your data is secured, especially when it leaves your organization. There's a level of trust that needs to happen. We've done a series of webinars in this month, and we continually do it throughout the year. We want to make sure that we're constantly working on gaining and earning your trust as we're protecting student data. If you haven't seen Myhub before, here's the entry screen at myhub.org. How is Myhub secured? And our goal here is to highlight what drivers were there decided to help build the best practices when it comes to identity proofing and authentication. And identity proofing and authentication seems pretty easy if you think of it from a Department of Motor Vehicles perspective. You go into the DMV, you have to provide some sort of proof you are who you say you are before they give you a driver's license. Kind of the same concept that we're going to elaborate here. But it's important to know that this wasn't just something that we arbitrarily chose how to do this with the level of security. There's definitely certain processes that are required. A lot of thought went into the standards and best practices that drove us to our current implementation of Myhub, and it really sets the stage for a lot of our future service lines to follow. And again, it was that rare opportunity from the ground up. We got to incorporate security at every step of the way. We're also going to highlight at the end how this works with accessing Myhub via an institution single sign-on or via social media accounts such as Google or LinkedIn. And then really going into this, what is Myhub? And I think the picture states it best. It's a centralized and secure online destination where learners can access all other academic records from multiple institutions. And this is really a different concept because it's one user accessing everything now, which really makes it a little bit of a challenge and really critical that we identify people and make sure they are who they say they are. As far as how does Myhub work, right from the pages from the website, I really pulled this in case this is something you wish to reference down the road when you're talking to your security teams or IT teams on what Myhub is and how it works and why we sign up. And again, this really goes back to NSC's got all the records in one place. We're now making it in a more appealing and way for students to access their data. And I'm literally a good example for a use case for Myhub. I did 20 years in the military. I attended a college at every base, a different college every 2 years for 20 years. And every time I went to a new college and signed up and enrolled, I had to pull one transcript, 2 transcripts, 5 transcripts, my arts transcripts. And it was a nightmare for me every time I went to a new institution. But I was determined to get that. So this is a good use case that every time I did this, the only way that I was ever identified as who I said I was somebody looking at my military ID. There's an easier way to do this. So what we really have two core drivers when accessing Myhub. And it really comes into identity and authentication. And just like anything, before getting access, you have to prove you are actually who you say you are. And then once you're done with that part, you have to prove that your credentials for your identity aren't compromised in order to get access. And it's not about making it hard to access your data. It's about making it safe and secure that the malicious actors can't access your data. So how do you do that? And what we did, we used best practices and already vetted standards. Here we followed the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. It's an organization that came out of the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002, NIST. They work for the Department of Commerce, and over the last 18 years, they really helped drive the IT security standards globally throughout the world. So one of the things that they have are what they call special publications. And they have about 100 plus special publications on technology standards. One of these included a standard on what they call digital identity guidelines, special publication 800-63-3. That's a 75-page document, in-depth document on exactly how to make sure that somebody, when they identify themselves, it's truly them. And as we reference a special publication, there's a key concept that your standards for identity and authentication are based on, and that's the sensitivity of the data. So if somebody was trying to access a database that had their nickname, we want to have the same requirements as if they're trying to access a database that has their social security numbers. So the sensitivity of the data really drives how hard or difficult we make it for people to access, or more specifically, how hard it is for malicious actors to try to compromise that access. And then, a couple more examples. We try to make it a common sense approach with the security level 2. People are trying to access PII. We don't need them to go through the methods as if they're trying to access Fort Knox. It's not the same. Or somebody's trying to access a police dispatching system. There's a lot more, but there are some minimum standards that we wanted to make sure that were there. And what they call these standards are levels of assurance. And there's 2 levels of assurance for identity and for authentication. And I'm going to go into more detail here in a second. NIST calls out what they call identity assurance levels. And these identity assurance levels shows the degree of confidence that an applicant really has to prove their identity. And it might be a driver's license, a passport, or a military ID, or it might be a self-attestation. And then there's what they call an authenticator assurance level, that once they prove who they are, how do we ensure that the device they're using is truly coming from them? And that authenticator assurance level might require that in order to do that, you have to use a multi-factor authentication, such as an authenticator app or an SMS text or an email. So that's really identity. And then the second driver here is what they call authentication. The Clearinghouse follows the concept of zero trust. And what that means for the safety of the learner data, we trust nothing. And nothing means we don't trust the person, we don't trust the device until that trust is earned. There's too many bad guys out there. 80% of all breaches involve compromised credentials. Zero trust, that concept really helps to greatly reduce that risk. And exceptions typically don't exist within zero trust. Zero literally means zero, nothing, nobody. It's not meant to be a hardship, but meant to exhibit a high degree of safety and security of the learner data. And that was a lot to wrap in, but I'm going to go into a little bit easier details here. So the first one, let's dig a little bit deeper into what they call identity proofing. The sensitivity of the data really drives the required assurance levels. So if you look at the chart on the right there, there's 3 assurance levels, assurance level 1, 2, and 3. And then depending on the type of data, directs what type of assurance level. is identified for the data. And then on the bottom, the identity assurance level dictates the type of process you have to follow. So I'm going to go back to an example about, say your data was a nickname and you wanted to access the database that said, and I'll use myself as an example, I'm called Johnny, is my nickname. Now, if I looked at that impact and assurance levels on that chart on the right, if I'm looking for a nickname, would I consider that to be something associated that might involve a civil or criminal violation? Nope, easy enough. I go up to the next one. Is it something dealing with personal safety? And personal safety means life and limb. Means you have there is an opportunity where somebody's health might be in jeopardy or harm, like a police dispatching system or a fire department on the type of systems that they use. Well, my nickname has nothing to do with that. Unauthorized release of sensitive information. There's nothing sensitive about Johnny. It's not going to create any harm to agencies. I'm not going to lose my money, if somebody out there says that they're Johnny. So then it really comes out to that top impact level. It's an inconvenience. So my assurance level is low. So that's one example. Now, if I were to take another example, let's look at that 911 dispatching system for fire and police that really is helping keep the community safe. In order for me to access that system, I'm going to go through here. Does it deal with civil or criminal violations? No, but personal safety, probably. So at the minimum, it's going to be an assurance level 2 or 3. And they call it out low, moderate, and high between 2 or 3, just to get a little bit more granular. But for something with a personal safety, I'm going to look at something more granular. So we're going to shift to that chart on the bottom. I know from the name Johnny, if I'm accessing that database, that it was an identity assurance level 1. And if I look at that chart, it says, well, in order for me to access that database, all I have to do is self-assert I am who I am, and I can get access. Now, with that 911 system, you wouldn't necessarily want somebody to assert that, hey, I am authorized to have access to a 911 system. Go ahead, give it to me. Well, if you look at the identity assurance level 3, you've got to provide proof in person. And there's certain levels of proof in person that you have to do, and that there's no exception. And then we have PII, and let's take this to the next level. We're all working with learner data. Learner data is truly PII. There is an unauthorized release of sensitive information can cause some sort of harm. So that would be an identity assurance level 2. For identity assurance level 2, there's one of two options. You either have to prove in person you are who you say you are, or remotely. There's a certain standard according to another special publication on how to use a third-party service. So now we're going to shift into a little roadmap and walk through this process. So this is really the journey, a user journey, going through the identity proofing process itself. And no matter how they're doing this, there's some core concepts. The first one is resolution. The applicant is asked to provide some sort of evidence to prove who they are. It might be a driver's license, a military ID, a passport, or if it's done remotely through a third-party service, and a lot of times, a lot of the financial institutions require identity services before they get access, or if you've access to credit bureau, that's a good example that does some sort of identity proofing. They're going to ask you a series of questions that only you as the individual would know the answers to, that would authenticate and prove without a reasonable doubt that you are who you say you are. So that initial evidence is collected, and then it's got to be validated. So somebody actually checks that that driver's license is the applicant. They literally hold it up and they do a facial recognition. Yep, that's John. We're going to give him access. He is fine. Or that system, that remote system, is able to validate with high degree of accuracy on their own standards that, yeah, they answered these questions that only he or she would know. We're going to say that that is him. Once it's validated, the verification goes through, and then the linkage between the claimed identity and the real life existence of the subject is presented, and then they become a subscriber. Now that they're a subscriber, it's great, and they can move forward. So that's the identity proofing. Now that we know the person is who they say they are and the person is validated, now what? Well, the next big piece is, and this is the second core driver, is making sure that whatever device that authorized individual is using is an actual authorized device. And an example I like to say, now that the person confirmed, how do we know that their device wasn't compromised? And these are levels of security and diligence that we have to show at the clearinghouse or any organization to keep the learner data safe. And similar to those identity assurance levels, we now have what they call an address authenticator. We have to address the authenticator assurance level. And these are like multi-factor authentication. And there's similar charts, but what it turns out for PII is that it's really an authenticator assurance level 2, that we have to use some sort of second factor as a reasonable amount of security to allow that device access. And we know for PII, again, that's AAL2, and that's why we use MFA when people try to access through Myhub. It really comes down to checks and balances that somebody with compromised credentials aren't trying to access through an approved identity. And again, I'll go back to one stat over and over again. 80% of the breaches involve compromised credentials. It is one of the most highly used tactic and techniques by malicious actors to get into somebody's data. So I've thrown a lot at you. Now it really comes down to what does all this really mean? And to try to simplify this, some sort of entity has to do an identity proofing before a user can access their data. With Myhub, it's either the institution or a third-party service that we subscribe to. If it's done via the institution, such as single sign-on, this is acceptable proof. Somebody actually checked something before the institution gave the student an account, that they're using that account to access into Myhub. NSE is not going to second guess the institution's proof of their students. That is perfectly acceptable and transferable, and that is great. But the other option that we built into Myhub, maybe an organization doesn't wish to use single sign-on. They want to let students use social media and make this more accessible to students from wherever they're trying to access this from. So the institution doesn't necessarily have the means to validate the social media account truly belongs to the identity. So if it's a social account like Google, Gmail, or LinkedIn, NSC uses a service from Ideology. And Ideology is a third-party service that does identity proofing through remote mechanisms. A lot of their clients are in the financial services, and a lot of our configurations for Ideology is based off the financial services, more stricter controls that they have in place. And then lastly, what this service actually does, it asks a lot of key questions to validate individuals, although they're using social accounts, that these individuals are truly who they say they are. And what I was mentioning early, that the questions are going to be so difficult that only that person would reasonably know the answer to those questions to validate their identity through a remote mechanism. So once that happens, the users along with their devices are then validated for actual access to the data from a device. So we go from identity proofing, where we go into the authenticator assurance levels, and it's based on zero trust. And NSC uses a third-party service called Okta. And Okta is widely acclaimed in the space. They basically do fraud detection and lets users choose their MFA mechanism, such as an authenticator app, email, or SMS. And when I say fraud detection, the stuff that it checks for is that if a user tries to access their data from the United States at 1 o'clock, and they try to access their data from India at 1:25, that is just physically not possible. A user can't travel that far within 30 minutes. So it's that fraud detection that we have in place to also provide that level of diligence that only authorized devices from these identified individuals can access their data. And this is what really minimizes that risk, with 80% of the breaches are accomplished via compromised credentials. It really minimizes the risk and ensures that only approved devices by the identified learner can access their data. And all really goes into the clearinghouse's culture. We're doing everything we can to keep the learner's data safe. So if your school participates, it lets you move forward, or you can use your Google or LinkedIn social media accounts. And once you were to access via those social media accounts, I tried to do a very high level drawing here on how this will look. So, and we'll walk through two examples, Sue and George. So Sue goes to college Y. Her school uses single sign-on. Her school validated her identity when she got her school account. So she has met the first check there, the identity assurance level. We don't need to validate her identity again. Step one, good to go. We now move to device authentication. Once the identity is established, it goes to Okta, our third-party service. It validates the device as an authorized for connection, and bingo, they've got access. It's that simple, unless there's malicious activity involved, and then it's intentionally there to make sure it's hard for the safety of the data. We then have George. George goes to College Z. College Z decides that they're not going to do single sign-on. They're going to have their students use their own social media accounts. In this case, George has a Gmail account and he requests access. The moment he requests access, he's prompted through NSC's third-party ideology service to verify his identity. At this point, ideology comes back and says, George answered questions that only George would know. This is really George. We're fairly confident. Step one, check, just like Sue. Now, both of their identities are checked. George now gets routed to Okta, same process. They validate his device is authorized for the connection and for future connections, and he's got access. So, I mean, although it seems complicated between identity proofing and the authentication, it really comes down to those two core drivers. We're making sure the individual is who they say they are, and they're only accessing on a device that they have authorized to access from. With that said, I'm going to go into the last slide. In closing thoughts. The chart on the right is actually the cross mapping of the identity assurance level and the authorized or the authenticator assurance levels. So if you've got personal data, it automatically at the IAL2 level, you can only use an AAL2 component, meaning PII is identity assurance level 2. If you use PII, when you cross map it, you can only use MFA as a minimum standard. So that's pretty important, and that's what really drove our standards on how we built Myhub and secured Myhub. And you can always go stricter and stronger with your security. You just can't go less secure than what the standards indicate. With that said, the Clearinghouse is exceptionally deliberate on prescribing identity proofing or authentication. We use the standards and best practices for how this is configured. We truly use the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. We don't try to assess what seems to be the best level. We really want to use those proven standards that have been vetted globally and replicate those to make sure that it's done correctly and securely. One question we're asked often, and I thought it's worth a bullet here, my institution uses single sign-on with MFA. Do we have to make the students do MFA twice? I'm going to tell you, I won't say unfortunately, this is a good thing, yes. And the reason it's yes, it's based on zero trust. The reality is all security isn't created equal and it's not always enabled. Sometimes institutions have no way of knowing if their MFA is configured fully. It's not as simple as turning something on. There's a lot of components that have to be disabled to make sure malicious actors can't bypass MFA. And we don't have that insight into how the institutions do that, nor should we. But that goes back to that concept of zero trust. This is where it's on the clearinghouse to make sure that every connection is verified and validated and authorized. We just really don't want to take the chance with protecting learner data. So that really wraps up the whole conversation about Myhub, the security of Myhub, why we do identity proofing, why we do authentication levels, and how this really becomes the driver for a lot of our future products to make sure that we're meeting these standards that are globally recognized. If there's any questions out there, please don't hesitate to ask me. I'm sure Tara is more than happy to answer any questions as well from the business perspective, or if you've got questions down the road, we're an open book at the Clearinghouse. We want to make sure that you're comfortable and assured that your learner data is secured going through our hands.
Thanks so much, John. That was awesome. We do have one question so far for a student that has a FERPA or financial aid or financial hold at the clearinghouse. Are they stopped from obtaining any information? Currently, if students go through self-service, it stops them before they get to the clearinghouse page to get a verification.
that Myhub pulls all the data from what the school provides us, from the institutions provide us. So if it is marked for a FERPA block or something of that sort, it's typically replicated throughout all of our business lines.
Yes, so the students will not be able to generate verifications within Myhub if they do have a FERPA hold. And they're instructed to loop back to the school if they have any questions. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. This has been great. Again, thank you so much, John. Very, very much appreciated.
Yep, we're open books. Don't hesitate to ask.
So the question is Myhub something schools need to sign up for? It is. So schools need to have a master service agreement, which I think most schools at this point have transitioned over to. And then there is an additional statement of work for Myhub. However, the implementation process is pretty straightforward. So if you do have questions or are interested in signing up for Myhub, you can contact your regional relationship manager, and you're welcome to reach out to me directly, and I can loop you to the appropriate person. So thank you so much again. You're always able to reach out to us. We're happy to continue the conversation offline.